Greetings, respected viewers. I'm George from Ireland, and I'm here at the monument of the Reverend Charles Wesley. So Wesley is the brother of the better known John Wesley, founder of the Methodist Church. So both of them were sons of a Church of England clergyman. They weren't Londoners, they grew up quite far away in the countryside. They both went to Oxford University, where they're known for their very diligent approach to their studies, and because they're so methodical, the word Methodist applied to them. And they formed the Holy Club, a group of undergraduates who were very fervent about their Christian faith. So they brought up Anglicans, that's to say members of the Church of England, but they began to feel it was rather cold, formulaic, and didn't meet the needs of the growing industrial cities. It didn't reach out to the working class enough, was too concerned with the upper class and hobnobbing and so on. Anyway, so they were both ordained Church of England priests, John Wesley and Charles Wesley. They'd both been to Christ Church, Oxford, which was the grandest college in the university. And they were both stellar intellectuals, because it wasn't difficult to get in to this university if you had a decent grounding in the classics in those days. Remember, the 18th century, a lot of people didn't even go to school at all. So Charles Wesley was born in 1708, and by 1730 graduated well on his way to ordination. So Methodism started out as a movement within Anglicanism. It was only decades later they reluctantly broke away from Anglicanism. Some people dislike this, associated with radicalism. So churches in big cities often hadn't moved on for decades, were too small to accommodate the growing congregation. People felt they should wear their Sunday best. A lot of the proletariat, well, they were lumpen proletariat, because they really were wearing rags. Sometimes they weren't even shod, so they felt ashamed to show up, and people who'd paid for a pew in church could have that one, and it really was quite inegalitarian, not very welcoming. It wasn't the spirit of when two and three are gathered in my name, I am present. So they began preaching out of doors, and they started building new churches and making everyone feel welcome, even the poorest, even those who didn't have any decent clothes to wear, and try to do something to alleviate poverty. Another big issue at the time was alcoholism, and so they tried to persuade people to turn away from the demon drink and to embrace the Lord instead, and also tea. They weren't against tea on principle, but tea was quite a new thing. It had only been drunk here since the 1660s and had to come from China and later on from India. So it was a very long and expensive voyage to get it here. Tea was very pricey. So some people were beggaring themselves drinking tea simply because it was fashionable. And they said, well, don't be drinking tea if you can't afford to put food on the table otherwise. So that was that. They were one of 16 siblings, John and Charles Wesley. Charles got married, had several children. That went well for him. John, not so well, though John Wesley did marry. His marriage was not a success for reasons they chose not to disclose. He and his wife separated after a few months. They had no children. And that was that. They didn't divorce. Divorce in the 18th century was a very lengthy and expensive process, required an act of parliament. There were very limited grounds for divorce. Adultery had to be quite strong proof, or could be a confession, or could be bestiality, could be severe cruelty. Bearing in mind a man beating his wife was lawful at the time. It would have to be heavy violence to justify the claim of cruelty. So it was regarded as an absolute scandal whether you sinned against a sitting divorce. So there was no way he could be a religious leader if he got divorced, so he didn't. But Charles Wesley, a very different story, stayed with his wife. He lived to 80, she lived to the age of 96, which was positively a Methuselahan age for the 18th century. Charles Wesley, one of his sons, Samuel Wesley, was a well-known Methodist minister, hymnodist and so forth. Charles Wesley, he'd been to Westminster School, one of the most distinguished schools in the realm, unlike his brother John. I think about Charles Wesley, he's best known as the writer of hymns, and he composed over 6,000 hymns, including some of the best-loved hymns in the English language. So anyway, he and his brother were widely travelled, spreading their sort of Christianity and reaching out to people. Greater simplicity, greater emphasis on the Bible, and equality and things like that, and not being so ritualistic, which they felt was sort of halfway to Roman Catholicism. They weren't exactly political, but some of the Methodists were more inclined to radicalism. Remember, the two major parties at the time were the Whigs and the Tories. The Tories, well, the Church of England being the Tory party at prayer, as people said, which was never quite accurate. But the Tory party, well, wanted to discriminate against Catholics as well as against dissenters, as in Protestants outside the Church of England. Some of the Tories then began to have a bit of a soft spot for Catholicism, saying that we shouldn't be discriminated against by law. The Whigs tended to be more anti-Catholic, but say, well, let's go easy on the dissenters. That's to say, Protestants outside the established churches, as in Congregationalists, Plymouth Brethren, Baptists, whoever else, Quakers. So Wesley, when he died, he was buried here in what was then St Mary's Church. Unfortunately, it was demolished in 1949. They didn't really value these things. We're in Marylebone, London, as in St Mary le Bone. There's a church called St Mary le Bone, but Mary le Bone got bastardized into Marylebone. So the River Tyburn, well, still flows underneath one of the lost rivers of London. That's why there's Tyburn Shrine and Tyburn Tree, where people were turned off, as in hanged. So and this glorious 18th century church was knocked down after the Second World War. There have been churches on this site for centuries. The Duke of Portland, a very notable aristocrat, he was lord of the manor, as in he owned most of the land. Manor as in M-A-N-O-R, like there's a manor house, not manor as in behaviour. So it's an awful pity we lost the church, which was so historic. Francis Bacon, the judge, he was married here. William Hogarth, the artist, he decorated it. So James Gibbs, a very famous architect of the late 18th century, the early 18th century, he also lies buried somewhere under where we are. And Richard Brinsley Sheridan, the celebrated Irish playwright, he got married here to Miss Linley. The poet Lord Byron, he was baptised here. His house no longer stands. Admiral Lord Horatio Nelson had his only child baptised here. That's Horatia, who was born to his mistress, Lady Emma Hamilton, and on and on. Many more distinguished people were involved with the parish, but sadly it's lost. So this memorial has been moved slightly from its original position. So in 1950 they moved it, and that's that. Okay, so perhaps that's enough about Charles Wesley for the moment.